Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, my question is, after a long struggle and all that in Tamil Nadu, Periyar thought, Hinduism is the basis for all the caste and eradication, and finally ended up in saying no God. That is the final answer to him. Is secular humanism an answer to completely eradicate caste?
Well, I can, Suraj, you want to go? I could start.
Oh, no. After you, Ajantha, please go ahead.
So I think for me, secular humanism is perhaps an end goal. But I don't think that we can start with the presumption of either equality or the lack of difference, right? I mean, we have to start where we are, which is in a society, and this is whether you're talking about India or the United States. I mean, these are societies that have been structured by historically derived advantages and disadvantages, right? When you think about something like caste, I mean, caste is not simply a religious ideology of purity and pollution, right? Caste is it's a material structure, right? Where some people have availed of every opportunity and been afforded every resource for their own advancement and at the expense of others. So for me, first and foremost, it's a political economic structure, right? It's one which has allowed some to sort of extract labor and value from others, right? And benefit off of that. So I don't know that we can get to secular humanism without recognizing these kinds of birth-based differences, birth and labor-based differences as foundational to social inequality. We have to start there, right? You have to start there and keep that in view in whatever kind of social policy you enact. You have to keep those historically derived differences in view. And I don't, one can say that, the Indian Constitution as a mechanism for instituting formal equality, secular formal equality, right, is a document of secular humanism. But it's so far from the lived reality of people, right? So you can say secular humanism is an ideal, is a societal ideal, but how do you bring it about without recognizing differences and addressing them head on? And I think this is what something like reservations try to do, not just reservations, but all kinds of other sort of policies which address lived inequalities, right? There's and recognize the huge gap between formal equality and substantive inequality, right? One has to bridge that gap to even start talking about humanism. Because I often think that terms like secular humanism become a kind of an easy out, right? It becomes a kind of formalistic ideal that doesn't recognize lived differences. I suppose that's what I would say. And I mean, just to speak to sort of the Periyar bit, I think one of the things that's being really brought out by the Dalit movement today is the sort of limits of Dravidianism, right? The sort of the inability of Dravidianism to address the Dalit question head on, right? That even though Dravidianism was a sort of vehicle for the advancement of intermediate castes, that ultimately it too was so trapped in a kind of politics of relative status, right? Which prevented it from reaching for a politics of true equality. And I think that's the next step, right?
My friend Dr. Soma Ilangovan and I continue to have these conversations. He's an ardent Periyarist, and I love about him for that. He keeps on probing us and try to think and try to and force us to think about Periyar's ideology. And I think, unfortunately, Periyar's ideology has not yet become a national one, and I think that needs to really remedied. Although Periyar was taken to all India by Kanshiram, who of course nationalized his radical vision, really removed him from the quote unquote South Asian context and put forward it. And I think that's one of the way I can say, Soma, that we can work on this. But the problem is secular is prostituted by almost every other political lineage. They have really decreased the values of secular. Everybody will claim to secularism. Congress, for example, is almost a flag bearer of secularism. And what does secularism means? It's just to pit Hindu-Muslim contrast. That's their secularism. Their secularism doesn't go beyond that. And I think that's why, as Ajantha was saying, Constitution is a secular humanist document, India's Constitution. And I use this word very deliberatively, simply to say that, to point out to some of the limitations that we couldn't really, who believed in secular values, who believed in humanist values, couldn't really own it up and allowed wild forces to own it up. And when they owned that up, they took away our own appreciation of secularism. And that's why I say and of course, to every religion you talk to, they will claim secular humanist values. The Sikh will say, the Buddhist will say, the Hindus, the Brahmins will say. I mean, nobody would like to be non-secular in a democratic country. And I think, so the goal is great, but I'm just saying the concepts that are introduced by us are appropriated by someone else and proposed into a very vulgar form. We cannot afford to allow to, that should not have to happen. But now that has happened. Now, what do you do with that? Is, do you reclaim what was your concept in origin, or then you propose another modern form to this already existing concept? And I think that's something will take us a long time to discuss, but I think that's one way I will look at it. Thank you.
Okay. The next question, I would go with Aruna Anum Khan.
I'm Aruna from Pakistan. So my question is, can the global democratic forces support for a new global order for controlling this job caste discrimination differences?
Sorry, Aruna, can you expand on that a little bit? I wasn't sure I understood the question.
My question is, does these democratic forces support or controlling the job caste differences in the South Asian region or in the US?
So I think
who wants to take it?
Sorry, Ajantha, she has also dropped in the chat box the question. It's just, are the US origin companies practicing on-job caste discrimination in South Asia?
Oh, I see.
I'm not offer clarity, right?
Yeah. I'll say this again. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about this assault on reservations is that, if you actually look at India's political economy, rampant privatization since the 1990s has meant that some of the most coveted jobs, right? I mean, the real sort of means of social and economic mobility now lie in the private sector, where there are no reservations, right? But of course, this sort of paradoxically, precisely because there are no reservations in the private sector, it is touted as a caste-free space. So yet again, you see this bizarre sort of equation between reservations and caste, right? As if any space that doesn't have it is caste-free. Now that's far from the case in the private sector. And this is whether you're talking about Indian companies or transnational companies that have located in India, right? Now, no one will say that caste is practiced in these spaces, right? No one will say that. And there certainly aren't any mechanisms for addressing caste discrimination, because once again, the private sector is assumed to be caste free. Now, so yes, caste discrimination is practiced in the Indian private sector. It's rampant in the Indian private sector. It's also the case that because of the absence of reservations, the private sector has become a site of retrenching caste privilege, right? If you look at IT, for instance, the IT managerial class is overwhelmingly not just upper caste, but Brahmin, right? So there you see, the sites of caste privilege have shifted over time, right? So the very groups that once monopolized the civil services, right? They once monopolized the civil services. They were once the kind of giants of the public sector. Now they monopolize a new space, right? So we have to think about caste as a highly mobile, right? Adaptive social form, right? It has moved from the village to the city, from the public to the private sector, and it has traveled abroad. And everywhere it goes, it operates as a structure of what Ambedkar called it, of graded inequality, right? Where people are assumed to inhabit these sort of ranked positions, right? These kind of fine-grained hierarchies of value. You see that very much in the private sector. When I was doing my job, my research, one of the things I discovered was that when companies recruit engineers, when they recruit alumni from institutions like the IITs, invariably in the space of an interview, the applicant will be asked about their rank in the exam. And that question is intended to figure out if somebody belongs to the reserve category or the general category, right? Now, it might seem like an innocuous question, right? A rank in an exam, that's not about casteism. It's just about figuring out how well you did. But it's actually an alibi, right, for a question about caste. So there's so many different ways of asking questions about caste that on the surface do not seem to be about caste. And those kinds of things, those ways of diagnosing who is who and putting him in their place is everywhere. And it's very much within the Indian private sector, whether transnational companies or not.
So before going for the next question, I want to emphasize to the group here, like AKC, we started sending out solidarity statements. So, and also we're collecting testimonies. All the details on in our website. If you go to akcusa.org and go to under the menu intervention, you can see practice of caste. Underneath we have all the URL. I wish all the people, I appreciate if all people here can go and check the solidarity statement and put your signature on the bottom of the page if you are not done already. And also if you have some testimonies to record, or one of your friends has it, so encourage them, go ahead and submit it. So you have an option to be anonymous on the testimonies, so please do so. So that will help in many cases. So we are trying to keep AKC website as a single point of resource for this particular case. So next person on this is Jaya Anshul. Sorry, I pronounce your name, Hershal.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions. I think many of the audience are, I think, Brahmins here. But every time I hear, they have done this, they have done this. Even in Ajantha's presentation, we blame on IITs, or we blame on corporates and all. They have done it. Actually, when will Brahmin will take a responsibility on themselves, like Suraj covered? briefly in his presentation, that we always put it on other people. When each of you have take a responsibility of what your community has done to the Dalits, and what you have done to what you call as neutralize your privilege and all. Another question I have is, when I think Suraj called many of them as a comrade and all, but like if you see, every country has communist people, they raise issue of Black Lives Matter and all. If the communists from India, they are everywhere, but still, why caste is not an issue out of India, and why it has not been raised by Communist Party? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. I think that kind of question answered many times. Yeah, go ahead and keep it short so that we can jump on to the next one.
Yeah, no, I mean, I use the word they in the paper as a way of describing a structure and a process. But absolutely, I mean, the whole point of my talk and my work is to say that that all of us are inheritors of caste in one way or the other, right? And that needs to be acknowledged, right? Whether we're beneficiaries or victims of caste, there is no outside, right? We're all inheritors, and that this kind of claim to castelessness on the part of upper caste is precisely a way of disavowing that inheritance, right? Saying that I'm not a beneficiary. The reason I am successful in X and Y is because of my own hard work and my sort of innate talent. No. Yes, I think that the first, I mean, in some ways I feel like this is something that that has been said about race, right? Racism, race is not a Black problem, it's a white problem, right? And one can say the same thing about caste, right? Caste is not a Dalit problem, it's an upper caste problem. But it's also relational, right? Caste is not simply about one group or the other, it's about a kind of relationship, it's the relationship that has to be transformed. But I agree that the kind of initiative for doing so shouldn't lie, right, with the oppressed. It should lie with the oppressor. I mean, there needs to be a serious form of not just introspection, but a kind of acknowledgement of privilege, right? I mean, that has to be a starting point. And acknowledgement of privilege, which is very different from saying I myself am not casteist, right? I mean, it's so easy to say I'm not casteist, that I don't have any sort of personal animus towards somebody else. But that's not where privilege lies. It's not in it's not in the act of making of passing a comment. Privilege is about something that you inherit over generations. And that's not something that you can easily just slough off and say you don't have. So I absolutely agree with you that the very first step to participating in an anti-caste struggle is for upper caste to acknowledge their own privilege and work against it. Work against these inheritances.
Okay, next person, Nishant.
Thank you for the fantastic talks, Suraj and Ajantha. My question is, in India, the endogamous marriage within castes and the system around it is part of the propagation of caste. So my question is, how does that work in the US? Or does it work in the US, especially among second plus generation Americans?
Suraj? Go ahead.
I mean, I think Ajantha, you are the best person suited because you have, you're American to kind of answer on that question. So maybe would you be comfortable taking that?
Sure. I mean, so I think, yes, I think, one of the kind of cornerstones of caste reproduction is endogamy, right? I mean, it's one mechanism for the reproduction of caste. I think it's interesting how the basis of endogamy shifts, right? So it's not always, kind of subgroups marrying into subgroups, right? I mean, I think that the forms of affiliation and who counts as a suitable partner can shift and have shifted. So if you look in the US, I think it would be difficult to find the very same patterns of kind of marriage within kind of subcastes, right? Like that's not what's happening. It's a kind of broader affiliation that matters, right? It's affiliation as upper caste or as Brahmins, right? I mean, these are kind of umbrella categories that are bigger than what you get in India. So the sort of the lines of affiliation have changed with migration. But I don't think that marriage is, I don't think kind of intercaste marriage is somehow going to magically dissolve caste. I really don't. I think you can have intercaste marriages that still very much work on the basis of caste affiliations. And I also think that the emphasis on marriage still doesn't get at the question of labor. I mean, marriage obviously is about property. And so in some ways it does redistribute property to marry outside of your caste. But I think that we really need to sort of keep our eyes on the fact that, there are forms of labor that are so foundational to the operations of caste. And that has to be kept in view alongside things like ritual prohibitions and endogamy. I mean, all of these things are sort of part of the puzzle. And I think that the pieces shift. They don't all work the same way in every place, right? So I think in the US, for instance, it works different. And part of the reason it works different in the US is because the spectrum of castes that are represented in the Indian American community is much smaller than what you get in India, right? I mean, as I said, this is an overwhelmingly upper caste population, right? Overwhelmingly. And so what that means is that the kind of lines of affiliation are different, unnecessarily so. Yeah. The one other thing I'll say, just very quickly, is that I saw that somebody in the post asked about the US-born generation and whether they also are casteist and kind of reproduce the same sort of prejudices as their parents. And I think for a lot of US-born kids, caste is not that legible to them, right? But what they fail to see, they really fail to see that their parents are beneficiaries of that system. And that it's precisely that which enabled them to come to the United States in the first place, right? They don't see that. And I think being here and being a kind of racial minority makes it even harder for them to see that. It makes it, and I can't tell you how many people I've heard say to me, oh, my parents came over with $8 in their pocket, right? So there's this kind of conception of a rags to riches story, right? Which is so false, right? They have no understanding of the forms of caste capital that their parents came over with. They have no conception of that because they haven't been told those stories. They don't know them, right? So they think that their parents came here with nothing and sort of made themselves out of whole cloth, you know, which is ridiculous.
Yeah. Next person, I would say, Suraj, you want to go or? So we
you
have
know,
a lot of other people.
I just put
Okay,
Ajantha
go
on
ahead.
spot on that question because I just thought the second part was relevant to her. She can, because now that I'm on season 2, India matchmaking, I'm literally rooting for Aparna so that she can find her spouse that she's so desperately. And you can see how caste nuances work. So maybe we will talk on that later at a later stage.
Okay. Rohit, you can go now.
Hi, Ajantha and Suraj. Thanks so much for such a erudite, awesome issues. I had a two-part question, and I think it's a segue from what, Ajantha, you were talking about, the rags to riches story. And it kind of goes to the notion of privilege that I want to hear both Suraj and you talk about. This privilege is not just present in the economic domain, but also the social domain and the political domain, and how caste basically aggregates all kinds of privilege. And when we talk about, moving away from caste hierarchies, how do we do that without addressing the question of privilege? So that's the first part. Second part is, I'm a student of nonviolent methodologies, and there are three important components there that I want to hear you guys talk about: truth, and then from truth to reconciliation, which is predicated on forgiveness. At the end of the day, we all will have to live with each other at some point after we feel that justice has been done towards us, and then so on and so forth. So what is the path from this point through the truth and reconciliation and forgiveness, through truth and forgiveness to reconciliation in your minds? What is that end dream state? I know somebody had mentioned, that, there's a label, maybe we want to be secular humanists, et cetera, but I'm also interested in the journey we collectively take to get there. So privilege and the journey we have to collectively take to get to a better state.
Thank you, Rohit, for bringing two important points. Let me begin with the last part, and I think I'm personally invested in the second question you have, and I really hope we come to that stage. For that, I think we need at least a genocide or a civil war. That's how the truth and reconciliation or the process of mitigating violence has been done. We can't really get to that stage without any acknowledgement of this violent past. So Dalit violence is not registered into the minds of dominant caste people. There is no book that kind of makes the dominant caste accountable and guilty for their act. They are not remorseful about that, let alone they are aggressive against every Dalit assertion. I have to be an intellectual, but I cannot be a Dalit intellectual. Why do you bring Dalit always? You should just be you should just be an intellectual. You should just be why do you? There is very little investment in my humanity, my history, my ancestry. And when I claim my ancestry, I'm going to challenge dominant caste existence, because you cannot exist as a dominant caste when I exist as a Dalit. It cannot at all have a cohabiting experience. It has to be either or. What then that does is that makes me a subhuman into the category of post hyphen, add whatever, modernity, post independence, post nationalism, whatever you claim about it. So this partnering of spaces and trying to get to the mountaintop is what I would assume is a good way to go, and I would also root for it. But Rohit, we have to also understand that the Dalit predicament has become a predicament of a failed civilization. And it is a civilization that was ruled by the people who controlled the labor, the creative genius of this community. And now for Dalits to assert themselves will itself means a mini passive civil war. Because once I am claiming on my identity, once I am uplifting the voice of my beautiful grandmother, who was a toilet cleaner or a landless laborer, I am actually creating a tremor into the minds of dominant caste people who cannot fathom the beauty and humanity that exists in my own blood. All they are used to looking at me is a person who is lazy, who is incompetent, who is not smart, who will always whine about his whatever problems and shift the blame on others. There is not at all an accountability of a human on a human basis. So when you say the truth and reconciliation, we have to understand these happened in an extremely violent societies who were then like, okay, let's come together. When as much as we love to have this conversation that India got a peaceful independence, which is a very much a propaganda that fits the narrative, people are still not independent. People are still very much relying to feed their on the state. So what that means effectively is we need to start acknowledging that this process, and my favorite word is healing, and it's a very spiritual approach that I take to this. It is something that we really need to close our eyes and really embrace the soulful self and the soulful other. Are we really willing to do that? You know, I'm almost like a coronavirus patient for a casteist society. My spit and my presence is taken as polluting, almost like a death-like predicament for them. And so I have to walk into putting masks of various blinders that other person is then made secure about, which means the mask is to mute myself, is to not express my agony or even shout out loud about my grievances. This, my man, to take place, we need to learn how to be regular, normal human. Indians love to be superhuman. They love to have this Brahma attitude amongst themselves, very much a Nietzschean concept of Übermensch. They don't want to have anything parallel to them. They even go back to claim that we developed mobile phones and aeroplanes in a Vedic times, when they were barely able to climb the trees or even put their hands in the soils and produce of their own. What we do in this whole process is we have a very complicated understanding of ourselves. I don't think Indians know who they are. It's a very fake, untrue representation of themselves. Now, how then can you be on the wagon of these blind people who don't know what their past is and who don't know what's their existential question? Let's, give a shout out to the people who are trying to center the existential question with the people all across. And Dalits, as I say always, are not looking for violence. They are not looking for any form of blood revenge. If they were looking for it, India would have never become a unified India. India would be broken in 1,000 pieces for whatever reasons. It is to the dedication and devotion of Dalits to the values of Buddha and to the values of their ancestors who upholded this, that India is still one country. But that should not be taken for granted. Again, I'm saying it should not be like, who knows, tomorrow they will be pissed and then we go, then you and I then can talk about truth and reconciliation. Maybe your kids and my kids or my great grandkids can work on that. But again, I don't want to end on pessimist note. I just want to be very cautious about this is a good approach, but where and how do we start, making sense of it?
Thank you, Suraj. We have less time, and but more people still asking questions. We love to entertain a few more minutes, but we have less time. So I'm just reading through some of the comments. We still have a lot of people joined in. Thank you for staying here. This is a question from Balamurli Natarajan to Suraj. The question, he said, help us to understand a little more about how anti-caste struggles in US diaspora context will need to be different from India.
Very good question, Murli. Thank you so much for that question. I think the anti-caste struggles in the US are, I would argue, at least in its apparent sense, slightly different from what happens in India, but also they focus very much in India. And the anti-caste, and again, I am making a generalized comment, each organizations have their own outlook towards this issue. But within my experience of working with all the Ambedkarite groups and anti-caste movements is we should also be wary about the commercialization of a certain issues in this context. How then caste becomes a fetish to be exploited in a capitalist economy for it to be a larger victim narrative. It's a story of people who have never had access to any resources are now starting to claim, and that's why uh, the the attitude that we continue to have in the Indian anti-caste movement is very much centered around claiming to the constitutional rights. There is a wholesome devotion to that. So the American anti-caste movement will also need to find out a constitution that they perhaps would need to embrace, or a different value. The anti-caste movement in America, especially movement-wise, they really need to pay attention to the Black struggle, and they really need to make solid allies, not just cosmetic allies. They really need to go beyond the comfort zone. They cannot afford to have an anti-caste movement without an involvement on critique of anti-whiteness, anti-patriarchy, and anti-forms of homophobic sentiments that operate. It cannot operate in a nutshell. It has to go in the same breath. They will also have to then connect to the global oppressions, be it oppression in Yemen, in Palestine, the worker solidarity in Brazil and Mexico, or to the student movements in Southern Africa. They have to think about the European Roma people. They have to invest in the indigenous people and their struggles in Australia. And of course, they also need to pay attention to other movements who are fighting for independence of their own from the already existing countries. Unless this wholesome focus is embraced, the anti-caste movement, as Harshal had pointed out in the earlier question, will not be taken into serious consideration by any communist or non-communist or anybody. We need to be present there. We need to rub our shoulders with the friends and solidarity people who are creating new movements. And I think Murli, that is something that is something I would like to just kind of frame as a self-critical note on that.
Thank you, Suraj. And I have another question from Dr. Balmurli to Dr. Ajantha. Tell us a little bit more about how merit helps so-called upper caste to appear casteless and entirely self-created. If you want, I can read out the question again, Dr. Ajantha.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah. Look, I mean, when we say the word merit, typically we are referring to the abilities of an individual, right? The kind of attribution of merit is usually done on the basis of individual ability, talent, et cetera, and this kind of hyper focus on the individual, which I think is exacerbated by something like an examination outcome, right? If you look at something like the JEE, which is the most fetishized of all of India's examination systems, what do we mean when we say that somebody has merit, right? We're talking about their performance in an exam where the rank seems to stand in for so much, right? It stands in for intellectual worth, it stands in for social worth. And we think we know something about somebody's abilities simply by looking at that, at that number. And I think that what that does, this kind of hyper focus on something like, right, a ranked result, what it does is it sort of obscures the fact that something like an exam, which is taken as an objective measure of merit, has to actually be placed within a history of inequality, right? The only way to understand the outcomes of an exam, the only way to make social sense of it, is to see it within this much larger context of, you know, whether it's caste inequality or racial inequality, right? So the term merit is a kind of, it's a sort of ideological obfuscation, right? It makes us think that these evaluations operate on a level playing field when they don't at all, right? It makes us, it forces us to treat individuals as individuals instead of as members of collectives who have inherited either advantages or disadvantages, right? Which kind of afford them certain opportunities. So for me, that's why merit is such a powerful term, because it does this ideological work of kind of severing the individual from a larger social collective, severing the present from the past, right? It does all of this work. So I think we actually need to reject the term altogether. I mean, for me, the term merit is antithetical to the project of either an anti-caste politics or a democratic politics. I think we have to refuse it, because meritocracy, for the most part, has been used in the service of reproducing inequalities, of retrenching privileges, right? It hasn't actually helped us in moving towards a more equal society, right?
Thank you, Ajantha.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, and Jai Bhim. First of all, great session. Really appreciate. One of the, I know it's a very, I would say, long-term question, but I want to ask. So I'm specifically talking about, US-based situation right now. So as per the current census, right, approximately we'll have up to 6 million, especially Indian folks in US. And if you look into that, 60, 70, 80% are from upper caste, and they are representing India. And that's why discrimination is happening all over the corporations here. And I have seen myself, and I'm a senior management in my company, and I have seen caste-based, religion-based discrimination. And there is uphill task on how to teach the US HR system as well as the US common people. So what's the long-term plan and short-term plan? Because this is a very dying, urgent need, because as we grow, like from 10, 20, 30 years from now, the Dalits, the Muslims, other minorities will be still minorities, and the upper class will be still the major portion, and they will represent India. So it's a very concerning issue, and I would kind of request, what's your take on that?
Look, I think a starting point has to be just something very simple, which is making caste visible, right? Caste is not visible in the United States. And so we need to sort of force the American public to recognize that Indian is not, this is an aggregate that makes no sense. Like, we have to disaggregate this category, right? And show that it is full of differences, and these are hierarchical differences, right? I think that's like the very first thing that needs to be done. Most Americans are not even aware of the caste composition of Indian society here, right? At all. They have no idea. So that needs to be sort of made visible. And I think something like the Cisco case is a really important one for doing that, right? It sort of blows open it forces us to look within the category of Indian and see where the differences lie. And I think, once we do that, and it becomes apparent that there is not just an overrepresentation, but almost a kind of a monopoly, right, of certain spaces by upper castes, I think then you can sort of address the question of privilege, right? Why is there such an overrepresentation of some groups within the most privileged, right, institutional settings in the US? Why is that? And this is where I think Suraj is right. I think the Black Lives Matter movement and the insistence, their insistence that we think of racism in terms of structural violence and not just in terms of interpersonal prejudice, I think that is going to be really important, right? Making people see casteism, not as interpersonal prejudice, but as structural violence, right? And a form of structural violence that has carried over and is being reproduced in the most kind of, I don't know, everyday ways, right? That has to happen. And I don't, I think, one of the things that is really difficult to do here is doing that work of disaggregating because Indians are a racial minority. It's really easy for them to claim a unique form of disadvantage, right? It's really difficult to see privilege in operation within a racial minority, right? And I think that, Indian upper castes have over and over again used this to their advantage. This has happened here, this has happened in the UK, right? Anytime the caste question is put on the table, the response is immediately to say, this is an insult to a religious minority or a racial minority, right? Right? And so that immediately becomes the response, and then everything shuts down, right? And so I think there needs to be a persistent insistence, right? That we not treat Indianness as this kind of unified whole, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Brother Ibrahim. Wa alaikum salam to you too. May Allah bless you too. And thank you really for bringing up that point about your own experiences and how, this demographic dividend is going to play an important and huge role, because again, the minoritization is continuing to happen as we change the scale. So how do we then again revisit the idea of minority, or is minority framework going to help us address the problem that exists among majority? Because we are minority within minority.
Exactly.
And if you look to the scalar level, the bigger majority, the bigger fish is happy for you to have your own. This is Murli arguing also in his article about that being your own cultural issue. It's a cultural difference, you guys resolve that. Let it not become an American issue. And that's what their investment is also, the Indian dominant caste, upper class people, that they would like not want it to be an American problem. They would like to just say it is an Indian problem. It has happened in India. It is there, but it is nothing to do with it. And that's why the California textbook pushback was also around the same lines. What we need to do is then that's why we have to take a different framework. And that's why I said it's an American Indian caste system. We cannot at all lose the approach of Americanness of this caste system. If we continue to look it as a question of something that has been transported, which it is, but then what does it do when it comes to the American soil? How does it mature? How does it grow? How does it not grow? These are the kind of questions we need to make American policymaker, American society responsible for. We cannot wash their hands out of this, this role. And we of course, we know Nico Slate and other people who have worked with the Indian community archives have identified how caste system was central to making an Indian identity in America. Majumdar was a famous case, but again, Thind is another case, and the cases kind of continue to go. But also in that, we have to look at the Punjabi experiences who are coming from Canada, who make a new Indian Americanness, and within that Punjabi lens, we have to frame this argument as to how an undivided Punjab, when it kind of moves around. And that's why that focus helps us to then decenter this argument from India. We really need to, as I said, our sister Aruna.
But this impulse to say that.
Yeah, no, so I was saying our sister from Pakistan, Aruna, is also here, who's also, this kind of questioning of looking at this whole problem. And so what I'm trying to say here is there has been a history of changing, remaking Indian identity, right? It's only after the Civil Rights Act when a new wave of Indianness kind of places itself. In the early times, as I was talking to some veterans who are Dalits, they don't say they have suffered caste discrimination because there were only so few of them, and they didn't feel the need to, and this Lakshmi Berwa was telling me that even the right-wing Brahmins would help him because he would protest against Indira Gandhi. But when Vajpayee would come, the centrist would come and help. So what I'm saying is, this is how the politics have always played. There was a fluidity, but now it has become a very, it has become the core or the bloodline of American social disparities that is existing, although it has not gotten the desired research survey-based attention. And it is maybe someone like me, Ajantha, and few other academics and organizations like KSC who need to get together and do a overall survey of how, asking these very basic questions. And I really commend your efforts, Kanak and Cheran and Karthik and all the AKC team for gathering those testimonials, because I think that is what is going to be the focus of how we make it. So that's why I say, let's draw a line. Let's draw a line. If we harp on the same South Asian relation experiences and then try to, it will be very easy to subside. And that's why we also have to make this argument. As I said, if you're working for Microsoft, if you're working for Google, if you're working for any of the companies, your bosses, as Ajantha was saying, are most likely Brahmins. So how do we then hold them accountable into this? And that's why this cannot only be Indian issue. It has to be anti-blackness also that has to go side by side. Of course, the experiences are different, but the level of oppression that has a social purchase continues. And I think that's how the focus should work.
And just one last thing, this kind of effort to say that that caste is an internal matter, right? And to sort of put a lid on it. This is not just something that happens in the United States, right? I mean, this was precisely the pushback to the 2001 Durban conference, right? Where the Dalit contingent was trying to make the argument, right, that casteism and racism are analogous. And the response of the Indian government was to say, this is an internal matter, right? This is not something which, that the analogy was false and wrong and misleading, and B, that this was in a sense a form of imperialism, right? This was a way of, this was the sort of illegitimate introduction of a human rights framework into what was an internal cultural matter, right? So once again, I mean, to go back to Murli's book, I mean, this effort to culturalize caste and make it anything but a question of power and inequality, that effort you see everywhere. It's not just in the US, it's also in India, right? I mean, this was Gandhi's approach as well, right? To say, this is an internal matter. Caste is something that is something which has to be resolved at a community level, right? That this is a social question. It's not a political question. It's not a legal question. It's a social question. I think these are all efforts to try to put a lid on caste, right? Put a lid on it and refuse to allow it to be adjudicated on the right grounds, which should be legal and political. Right? Those are the grounds on which caste has to be adjudicated.
Thank you, speakers. Thank you, everyone. And it was a great night. So people stayed here from 6 to 8 o'clock almost. And I really appreciate all your time and personal time. And especially people from the East Coast, or it's almost 11 o'clock there. And Suraj and Dr. Ajantha, wherever you are, I guess you are in East Coast. And so we also want to thank our co-sponsors. I just want to read out Boston Coalition of Seattle of Indian Americans, Global Indian Progressive Alliance, India Civil Watch International, Ambedkar Association of North America. Thank you very much. Good night and Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim. Thanks very much.
Jai Bhim. Thank you.
Thank you, Suraj.